The autumn mist clung to the Arizona territory like a shroud, swirling through the pine-covered hills that surrounded Tombstone. October 1886 had brought an early chill to the high desert, and Ethan Callahan pulled his worn leather coat tighter as his horse, Thunder, picked his way along the narrow mountain trail. The 43-year-old cowboy had been riding these paths for more years than he cared to count, but tonight something felt different. Wrong, somehow. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much. And continue with your story now." Ethan's weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. His steel-gray eyes constantly scanned the shadows between the towering pines, a habit born from years of living on the edge of civilization. He was heading back to town after checking on a remote mining claim when the sound shattered the night's silence. "Help! Somebody help me!" The voice was high, desperate. A child's voice, raw with terror that cut through Ethan's soul like a blade. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and the horse snorted nervously, sensing his rider's sudden tension. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. He pulled Thunder to a halt, straining to listen. The forest had gone deathly quiet, as if even the night creatures were holding their breath. Then it came again. "Please, anyone! I can't get down!" Without hesitation, Ethan spurred Thunder off the main trail and into the thick undergrowth. Branches whipped at his face as they crashed through the forest, following the sound of the terrified voice. The mist seemed to grow thicker here, creating ghostly shapes that danced between the trees. "Keep calling, son!" Ethan shouted into the darkness. "I'm coming! Here! I'm up here! In the big pine!" Ethan's eyes swept upward, and there, silhouetted against the pale moon, he saw a small figure clinging to the branches of a massive ponderosa pine, at least 30 feet off the ground. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his small frame trembling with cold and fear. "Hold on tight," Ethan called as he dismounted. "What's your name, boy?" "Tommy. Tommy Blevins." The child's voice cracked with exhaustion. "I've been up here for hours. My pa told me to climb up and stay quiet, but he never came back." Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd heard the name Blevins before. Fur trappers who worked the high country, good people trying to make an honest living in harsh territory. "Where's your father now, Tommy?" "I don't know." The boy's voice broke into sobs. "There were men. Bad men. Pa said they were after our pelts. He hid me up here and went to lead them away from the wagon. But that was before dark, and now—" A chill ran down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Apache raiders had been increasingly active in the area, and a wagon full of valuable furs would be an irresistible target. But something about this felt different, more personal, more calculated. "All right, Tommy, I'm coming up to get you," Ethan said, testing the lowest branches of the pine. "You just keep holding on." The climb was treacherous in the darkness, the bark slick with moisture from the mist. Ethan's boots struggled for purchase on the narrow branches, but years of hard living had kept him strong and agile. As he climbed higher, he could hear Tommy's ragged breathing above him. "You're doing real good, son," Ethan called softly. "Just a little bit longer." When he finally reached the boy, Ethan's heart clenched. Tommy was small for his age, with sandy hair and wide blue eyes that held far too much fear for a child. His clothes were torn, and his hands were bleeding from gripping the rough bark for so long. "Easy now," Ethan said gently, positioning himself on a sturdy branch beside the boy. "I'm Ethan Callahan. I'm going to get you down safe, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. "Are you going to help me find my pa?" The question hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, the kind that came with caring about someone else's fate. But looking into those desperate young eyes, he knew he had no choice. "Yes," he said simply, "we'll find him." The descent was even more dangerous than the climb up. Ethan had to half-carry, half-guide Tommy down through the maze of branches, all while fighting the growing certainty that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. When they finally reached the ground, Ethan immediately swept the area with his eyes, his hand never leaving his gun. "Tommy, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve and took a shaky breath. "We were coming back from our trap lines up in the high country. Pa had a real good haul, beaver, fox, even a couple of wolf pelts. We were going to sell them in Tombstone and maybe have enough to get through the winter without going hungry." Ethan nodded, encouraging him to continue. "We made camp about a mile from here near Willow Creek. Pa was cooking supper when he heard horses coming. He got real scared, real quick. Said he recognized the sound, that it was trouble." Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He grabbed me and ran to this tree, told me to climb as high as I could and not make a sound no matter what I heard. Did you see the men who came?" Tommy shook his head. "Pa made me promise not to look, but I heard voices, angry voices, and then gunshots." The boy's whole body began to shake. "After that, everything went quiet. I waited and waited, but Pa never came back." Ethan's mind raced. Professional raiders would have taken the pelts and moved on quickly. The fact that they'd apparently spent time searching, that they'd fired shots, suggested this was more than a simple robbery. Someone had been looking for something specific, or someone specific. "Tommy, did your father have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" The boy looked confused. "Pa never hurt nobody. He just trapped animals and minded his own business. The only person he ever had trouble with was—" "Who?" Ethan pressed gently. "Mr. Donovan. He runs the trading post in town. Pa said he was trying to cheat us, paying too little for our furs. They had words about it last month." Ethan knew Marcus Donovan, a shrewd businessman who'd built a small empire buying and selling goods in the territory. But would he resort to violence over a few pelts? It seemed unlikely, but in Ethan's experience, men had killed for far less. A distant sound made them both freeze. The soft whinny of a horse, somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees. Ethan's hand flew to his gun as he pulled Tommy behind the massive trunk of the pine. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his eyes scanning the misty forest. "Don't move until I tell you." The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the soft thud of hoofbeats on the forest floor. Someone was out there, moving carefully through the trees. Ethan counted at least 2 horses, maybe 3. "Callahan!" a voice called out through the mist. "We know you're out there. You've got something that belongs to us." Ethan's blood ran cold. They knew his name. This wasn't a chance encounter. They'd been waiting for him. But how? And what could they possibly think he had that belonged to them? "You've got 30 seconds to show yourself, or we start shooting," the voice continued. "And we know you've got the boy." Tommy whimpered softly, and Ethan placed a protective hand on his shoulder. His mind raced through their options. They were outnumbered and trapped, with nowhere to run. But these men wanted something from him, which meant they needed him alive, at least for now. "What do you want?" Ethan called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You know what we want. The map. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you and the kid walk away." "Map?" Ethan's confusion must have shown on his face because Tommy suddenly grabbed his arm. "The map," the boy whispered urgently. "Pa gave me something before he made me climb the tree. Said to keep it safe no matter what." With trembling hands, Tommy reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn from handling. Even in the dim moonlight, Ethan could see it was covered with markings and symbols. As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Ethan realized that Tommy's father hadn't been the victim of a random attack. Someone had been hunting for this map, and they'd been willing to kill for it. The question was, what was so valuable that men would murder a trapper and terrorize a child to get their hands on it? And more importantly, would Ethan and Tommy live long enough to find out? The riders were getting closer, their voices carrying through the mist-shrouded forest like harbingers of death. Ethan's mind raced as he studied the map in Tommy's trembling hands. Even in the pale moonlight, he could make out what appeared to be a detailed layout of the local terrain, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Listen to me carefully, Tommy, Ethan whispered, folding the map and tucking it into his own shirt. We're going to move very quietly to where my horse is tied. When I give the signal, you're going to climb up behind me, and we're going to ride like the devil himself is chasing us, understand? Tommy nodded, his young face pale but determined. What about my pa? We'll find him, Ethan promised, though his heart was heavy with the growing certainty that Jacob Blevins was likely dead. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. They began moving through the undergrowth, Ethan's experienced woodsman skills keeping their passage nearly silent. Behind them, he could hear the riders spreading out, searching methodically through the trees. "Check every tree, every rock," the leader's voice commanded. "They can't have gone far?" Ethan recognized the voice now. Silas Crane, a gunfighter with a reputation for taking any job as long as the pay was right. If Crane was involved, this was bigger than a simple robbery. Someone with serious money was behind this. They reached Thunder just as the sound of breaking branches announced that the searchers were getting dangerously close. Ethan boosted Tommy up onto the horse's back before swinging up himself. "Hold on tight," he murmured, and spurred Thunder into motion. They crashed through the forest at a reckless pace, branches whipping past their faces as Thunder's powerful legs carried them away from their pursuers. Behind them, shouts erupted as the gunmen realized their quarry was escaping. "There! They're heading for the main trail!" Gunshots rang out, bullets whistling through the trees around them. Ethan leaned low over Thunder's neck, feeling Tommy's small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. They burst out of the forest onto the main trail, and Ethan immediately turned Thunder toward Tombstone. The town was still 5 miles away, but it was their best chance of finding help and answers. As they rode hard through the night, Tommy spoke up over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Mr. Callahan, that map, Pa said it was real important. Said it was the reason we had to be extra careful this trip. Did he tell you what it was a map of?" "Not exactly, but I heard him talking to someone in town before we left. Something about a lost mine and how someone had been looking for it for 20 years. Ethan's blood chilled. A lost mine. In this part of Arizona, that could only mean one thing: the legendary Lost Dutchman's mine, rumored to contain a fortune in gold. Men had died searching for it, and many more had killed for even the hint of its location. But if Jacob Blevins had somehow come into possession of a genuine map to the mine, it would explain everything. The careful planning of the attack, the involvement of professional gunmen like Silas Crane, and the willingness to murder for the information. They rode in silence for another mile before Ethan noticed something that made his heart sink. In the distance behind them, he could see the flickering light of torches. Their pursuers were following, and they weren't giving up. "We need to get off the main trail," Ethan decided, guiding Thunder onto a narrow path that led toward an old mining camp he knew was abandoned. "They'll expect us to head straight for town." The abandoned camp of Silver Creek sat in a small valley, its empty buildings like skeletal remains in the moonlight. Ethan had been here before, years ago, when the silver vein had played out and the miners had moved on to more promising claims. He guided Thunder to the old assay office, a stone building that would provide better protection than the wooden structures. After helping Tommy down, he quickly unsaddled the horse and led him inside through the wide doorway. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Ethan said, checking his weapons. "Let them search the main trail while we figure out our next move." Tommy sat on an old wooden crate, looking small and lost in the abandoned building. "Mr. Callahan, do you really think my pa is—" "I don't know, son," Ethan said honestly. "But I promise you this. We're going to find out what happened to him, and we're going to make sure the men responsible pay for what they've done." He pulled out the map and spread it on a dusty table, studying it more carefully by the light of a small lantern he'd found. The detail was remarkable. Every ridge, every creek, every landmark was precisely marked. But it was the symbols scattered across the map that caught his attention. "Tommy, come look at this," he said. "Do you recognize any of these markings?" The boy peered at the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Some of them. Pa taught me about reading trail signs. This one here," he pointed to a symbol that looked like a twisted tree. "That's the old lightning-struck oak up on Devil's Ridge. And this, he indicated a series of small circles. Those are the water holes in Skeleton Canyon. Ethan nodded, impressed by the boy's knowledge. What about this? He pointed to a large X marked near what appeared to be a box canyon, surrounded by symbols he didn't recognize. I don't know that one, but Pa spent a lot of time up in that area, said he was checking his trap lines, but Tommy hesitated. But what? Sometimes he'd come back with dirt under his fingernails like he'd been digging, and once I saw him washing gold dust out of his clothes. The pieces were starting to come together. Jacob Blevins hadn't just found a map to the Lost Dutchman's mine. He'd found the mine itself. And somehow, word had gotten out. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, moving carefully around the building. Ethan blew out the lantern and drew his gun, motioning for Tommy to hide behind the old assay furnace. "Callahan!" Silas Crane's voice called from outside. "We know you're in there! You're trapped, and we've got all night!" Ethan peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. He could see at least 4 men positioned around the building, their weapons ready. They'd been found, and this time there was no easy escape. "What do you want, Crane?" Ethan called back. "You know what we want. That map. Hand it over, and we'll make this quick and painless." "And if I don't?" Crane's laugh was cold and humorless. "Then we'll burn you out. Either way, we get what we came for." Ethan's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a building with limited options for escape. But he'd been in worse situations before, and he wasn't about to give up now. Not with Tommy's life depending on him. "I've got a counteroffer," Ethan shouted. "Let me and the boy go, and I'll tell you where the mine is." "Nice try, Callahan, but we need that map. It's got more than just the location. It's got the key to getting past the traps." "Traps?" Ethan looked at the map again, studying the symbols with new understanding. The strange markings weren't just landmarks. They were warnings, indicators of dangers that protected the mine's entrance. "You've got 5 minutes to decide," Crane continued. "Then we start shooting." Ethan looked at Tommy, who was watching him with complete trust despite the terror in his young eyes. The boy believed Ethan would save him, would find his father, would make everything right. It was a responsibility Ethan had never wanted, but now that he had it, he'd die before he let the boy down. He began studying the building more carefully, looking for any advantage, any way out of their predicament. The old assay office had been built into the hillside, with thick stone walls on 3 sides. But the back wall? Ethan's heart leaped as he remembered something about the old mining camps. Many of them had been connected by tunnels, allowing miners to move between buildings during Indian raids or harsh weather. Moving to the back wall, he began running his hands along the stones, searching for any sign of a hidden passage. Tommy watched him with growing hope. "What are you looking for?" "A way out," Ethan murmured, his fingers finding a section of wall that felt different from the rest. These old camps were full of secrets. His hand found a loose stone, and when he pressed it, a section of the wall swung inward with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Well, I'll be damned," Ethan whispered. Outside, Crane's voice was getting impatient. "Time's up, Callahan! Last chance!" Ethan quickly gathered their few supplies and helped Tommy into the tunnel. "Stay close and keep quiet," he whispered. "We're going to get out of here, and then we're going to find out who's really behind all this." As they disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, the first gunshots began echoing through the abandoned mining camp. But Ethan and Tommy were already gone, swallowed by the mountain's ancient secrets. The hunt was far from over, but now Ethan had something he hadn't had before, a destination. The map would lead them to the Lost Dutchman's mine, and with any luck, to the truth about what had happened to Jacob Blevins. But first, they had to survive the night. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare of rough-hewn stone and stale air, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Ethan led the way with a small torch he'd fashioned from a piece of wood and some lamp oil, while Tommy followed close behind, his small hand gripping Ethan's belt. They'd been crawling through the mountain's bowels for what felt like hours when they finally emerged into another abandoned building, this one an old mine shaft office about half a mile from where they'd started. Through the grimy windows, Ethan could see the first pale light of dawn creeping across the Arizona sky. "Are we safe now?" Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from the dust and fear. "For now," Ethan replied, though he knew Crane and his men wouldn't give up easily. "But we need to keep moving. They'll figure out we escaped soon enough." He spread the map on a broken table, studying it in the growing daylight. The detail was even more remarkable than he'd first realized. Whoever had drawn this had intimate knowledge of the terrain, down to individual rock formations and seasonal water sources. "Tommy, you said your father was talking to someone in town about this map. Do you remember who?" The boy screwed up his face in concentration. It was at the saloon. Pa didn't usually drink much, but he was real nervous that night. He met with a man, tall fellow with a fancy mustache and expensive clothes. Ethan's heart sank. The description matched Marcus Donovan perfectly. If the trading post owner was involved, it meant the corruption went deeper than he'd imagined. "Did you hear what they talked about?" "Some of it. The man kept asking Pa where he'd found it, and Pa kept saying he couldn't tell him that. Then the man offered Pa money, more money than I'd ever heard of. But Pa said no, said it was too dangerous." "Too dangerous how?" Tommy shrugged. "Pa said the mine was cursed, that bad things happened to people who went looking for it. But the man just laughed and said that was superstition." Ethan studied the symbols on the map again. If Jacob Blevins had believed the mine was cursed, those markings might be more than just warnings about physical traps. They might be indicators of previous attempts to reach the treasure, attempts that had ended badly. A sound outside made them both freeze. Horses, moving at a steady pace along the main trail. Ethan peered through the window and saw a sight that made his blood run cold. Silas Crane was leading a group of 6 riders, but they weren't alone. Tied to one of the horses, barely conscious and covered in blood, was a man Ethan recognized from Tommy's description, Jacob Blevins. "Pa!" Tommy started to rush toward the window, but Ethan caught him. "Quiet!" he hissed. "They'll hear you." Tommy's eyes filled with tears of relief and terror. "He's alive. We have to help him." "We will," Ethan promised, his mind already working on a plan. "But if we go rushing out there now, we'll all end up dead. We need to be smart about this." He watched as the riders passed, noting their direction. They were heading toward Devil's Ridge, following the route marked on the map. It was clear that Jacob Blevins had been tortured for information and had probably given them enough to get started, but not everything. They still needed the map to navigate the traps and find the exact location. "They're using your father as insurance," Ethan explained to Tommy. "As long as they have him, they think we'll follow. And they're right, but not the way they expect." He studied the map more carefully, tracing the route to the mine with his finger. There were several paths marked, but only one that avoided most of the warning symbols. The others were marked with what looked like skull and crossbones, clear indicators of danger. "Tommy, I need you to tell me everything your father taught you about reading signs and tracking. We're going to need every advantage we can get." For the next hour, as they prepared to leave their hiding place, Tommy shared his knowledge of the wilderness. Despite his young age, the boy had learned well from his father. He could read weather signs, identify edible plants, and track animals through terrain that would challenge an experienced hunter. "Pa always said the mountain keeps its secrets," Tommy said as they prepared to leave, "but it also protects those who respect it." They set out on foot, following a parallel route to the one Crane's group had taken. Ethan had hidden Thunder in a box canyon about 2 miles away, and they needed to reach the horse before attempting to rescue Jacob. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. The trail wound through narrow passes and across steep slopes where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. But Tommy moved through it like he'd been born to it, his small size actually an advantage in the tight spaces. "Mr. Callahan," Tommy said during a brief rest, "what if we can't save Pa? What if those men—" "Don't think like that," Ethan said firmly. "Your father is a tough man and he's survived this long. We're going to get him back." But privately, Ethan was worried. Jacob Blevins had looked in bad shape, and men like Silas Crane weren't known for their mercy. Time was running out. They reached Thunder's hiding place just as the sun was reaching its zenith. The horse nickered softly in recognition, and Ethan quickly saddled him while Tommy kept watch. From here, we can take the old Indian trail, Ethan said, consulting the map. It's dangerous, but it'll get us to the mine area ahead of Crane's group. The Indian Trail was little more than a series of handholds carved into the rock face, a route that had been used by Apache warriors for generations to move unseen through the mountains. It was treacherous even for experienced climbers, but it was their only chance of reaching the mine before Crane. As they climbed, Tommy shared more of what he'd overheard in town. Pa said the man who drew this map was called Dutch Jake, and that he'd been killed by his own partner 20 years ago. But before he died, he hid the map and told someone where to find it. Who? A woman. Pa said Dutch Jake had a daughter, and that she'd kept the secret all these years. But recently, she'd gotten sick and needed money for medicine. The pieces were falling into place. A dying woman, desperate for money, had sold the location of her father's hidden map. But to whom? And how had Jacob Blevins gotten involved? They reached a narrow ledge that offered a view of the valley below, and Ethan's heart stopped. There, in a small clearing near a distinctive rock formation marked on the map, was Crane's camp. He could see Jacob Blevins tied to a tree, while the gunmen searched the area methodically. "They're looking for the entrance," Ethan murmured, studying the scene through his spyglass. "But they can't find it without the map. What do we do?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. They were outnumbered 6-1, and any direct assault would likely result in Jacob's death. But there might be another way. "Tommy, I need you to stay here with Thunder. No matter what happens, don't come down until I signal that it's safe. But no arguments. This is the only way." Ethan checked his weapons and started to climb down toward the camp. "If something goes wrong, you take that map and get to the sheriff in Tombstone. Tell him everything." As Ethan made his way carefully down the rocky slope, he could hear voices from the camp below. Crane was getting frustrated, and his men were starting to argue among themselves. "The old man's lying," one of them snarled. "He's sending us on a wild goose chase." "Maybe," Crane replied, "but he's told us the truth so far. The landmarks match the descriptions." Ethan reached a position where he could see the camp clearly. Jacob Blevins was conscious, but barely, his face swollen from beatings. The man's eyes were alert, though, scanning the area as if looking for something or someone. That's when Ethan noticed something that changed everything. One of the men in Crane's group wasn't a stranger. It was Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, a man Ethan had worked with for years, a man he'd trusted. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. Bradley had access to information about Ethan's movements, about his plans. He'd probably been feeding information to Crane all along. But if Bradley was involved, it meant the corruption went all the way to the top. Sheriff Morrison himself might be part of the conspiracy. As Ethan watched, Bradley walked over to Jacob Blevins and leaned down to speak to him. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the cruel smile on the deputy's face. "Your friend Callahan is probably dead by now," Bradley said loud enough for Ethan to hear. "And once we find that mine, your boy will be joining you both." Jacob Blevins raised his head with obvious effort. You won't get away with this. People will ask questions." "What people?" Bradley laughed. "A trapper and his kid go missing in Apache country? Happens all the time. And Callahan, well, he's always been a loner. Nobody will miss him much." Ethan's hand tightened on his gun. He'd heard enough. It was time to even the odds. But as he prepared to make his move, a new sound reached his ears. The distant thunder of approaching horses. Someone else was coming, and from the sound of it, they were coming fast. The game was about to change again, and Ethan had no idea if the new arrivals would be friends or enemies. The approaching riders emerged from the morning mist like ghosts from another world. Ethan counted 8 men, all heavily armed and riding with the purposeful determination of a military unit. At their head rode a figure that made Ethan's heart leap with hope, Sheriff John Morrison himself, along with what appeared to be a U.S. Marshal and several federal agents. From his hiding place among the rocks, Ethan watched as Crane's men scrambled to defensive positions, clearly caught off guard by the arrival of law enforcement. Deputy Bradley's face had gone pale as death, his hand hovering uncertainly over his weapon. "Silas Crane!" Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the clearing. "You're surrounded! Release your prisoner and surrender!" Crane's response was immediate and violent. "Like hell!" he snarled, drawing his gun and pointing it at Jacob Blevins's head. "You take one step closer, and the trapper dies!" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with both sides eyeing each other across the rocky clearing. Ethan knew he had to act, but any movement might trigger a bloodbath that would certainly claim Jacob's life. That's when Tommy's voice rang out from the ledge above, clear and brave, despite his fear. "Pa! I'm here! Mr. Callahan's going to save you!" The distraction was exactly what Ethan needed. As every head turned toward the sound of the boy's voice, Ethan burst from his hiding place, his Colt .45 blazing. His first shot took down the gunman nearest to Jacob, while his second sent another diving for cover. "Federal agents!" the U.S. Marshal shouted. "Drop your weapons!" The clearing erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as Crane's men found themselves caught between Ethan's assault from one side and the federal agents from the other. Deputy Bradley, realizing his position was hopeless, threw down his gun and raised his hands. "Don't shoot! I surrender!" But Silas Crane wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he grabbed Jacob Blevins and began dragging him toward a narrow canyon that led deeper into the mountains. "You want him alive?" Crane shouted over his shoulder. "Come and take him!" Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted after them, leaving the federal agents to mop up the remaining gunmen. The narrow canyon was treacherous, with loose rocks and hidden crevices that could trap an unwary pursuer. But Ethan had spent years in these mountains, and he knew them like his own backyard. Behind him, he could hear Tommy scrambling down from the ledge, determined to follow despite the danger. The boy's courage was remarkable, but Ethan couldn't let him walk into what might be a final confrontation. "Tommy, stay back," he called. "Help the sheriff with the prisoners." The canyon wound deeper into the mountain, following what appeared to be an ancient watercourse. As Ethan pursued Crane and his hostage, he began to recognize landmarks from the map: the twisted oak, the distinctive rock formations, the hidden spring marked with cryptic symbols. They were approaching the lost Dutchman's mine. The canyon opened into a circular basin surrounded by towering cliffs. At the far end, partially hidden by a rockfall, was the dark mouth of a cave. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone around the entrance, warnings in Apache and Spanish that spoke of death and cursed gold. Crane had dragged Jacob to the cave entrance and was using him as a human shield while he studied the markings on the walls. 20 years I've been looking for this place!" Crane shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. 20 years since Dutch Jake told me about it on his deathbed. You think I'm going to give up now?" "Let him go, Crane," Ethan called, his gun trained on the outlaw. "It's over. Your men are captured and the federal agents know everything." "Maybe," Crane replied, "but I've got the mine and I've got the hostage. That gives me some bargaining power." That's when Jacob Blevins, despite his injuries, managed to speak up. You don't understand," he gasped. "The mine, it's not what you think." "Shut up, old man." "No," Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger. "I found it 3 months ago. There's no gold, Crane. Dutch Jake was a fraud. The whole thing, it's empty." Ethan saw the doubt flicker across Crane's face, but the outlaw's greed was stronger than his reason. "You're lying! Dutch Jake's daughter confirmed it. She had his journal, his notes." "Then she lied to you," Jacob said simply, "just like her father lied to everyone else. The mine's been played out for decades. All that's left are old bones and broken dreams." To prove his point, Jacob gestured toward the cave entrance with his bound hands. There, barely visible in the shadows, were the skeletal remains of previous treasure hunters who had died seeking the legendary gold. Crane's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "No, it has to be here. I've killed for this. I've sacrificed everything." In his fury, Crane made a fatal mistake. He loosened his grip on Jacob just enough for the tough trapper to break free and dive to one side. Ethan's shot rang out simultaneously, catching Crane in the shoulder and spinning him around. The outlaw's return shot went wild, ricocheting off the canyon walls as he stumbled backward toward the mine entrance. That's when the mountain itself seemed to take revenge for decades of greed and violence. The gunshot had loosened rocks that were already unstable from years of erosion. With a rumbling that grew to a thunderous roar, the entrance to the lost Dutchman's mine collapsed in on itself, sealing the cave forever and taking Silas Crane with it. When the dust settled, Ethan rushed to Jacob's side. The man was battered and bloodied, but alive. More importantly, his eyes were clear and focused as he looked up at his rescuer. "Tommy," he whispered. "He's safe," Ethan assured him. "Brave as they come, that boy of yours." As if summoned by his name, Tommy came running into the basin, followed by Sheriff Morrison and the federal agents. The reunion between father and son was everything Ethan had hoped for: tears of joy, fierce embraces, and the kind of love that made all the danger and hardship worthwhile. Later, as they made their way back down the mountain, Sheriff Morrison explained how the federal agents had become involved. "We'd been tracking a conspiracy to defraud investors with fake mining claims," he said. "Deputy Bradley was feeding information to a group of con men who were using maps like yours to bilk money out of Eastern investors. When we heard about the attack on the Blevins family, we knew we had to move fast." "What about Donovan?" Ethan asked. "Arrested this morning. Turns out he was the mastermind behind the whole operation. He'd been buying up old mining claims and fake treasure maps, then selling shares to investors back east. The Blevins map was supposed to be his biggest score yet." Tommy, riding behind his father on one of the captured horses, spoke up. "So there really wasn't any gold?" Jacob smiled at his son. "The real treasure was right here all along, boy. Family, friends who will risk their lives for you, and the freedom to live honest lives in this beautiful country." Ethan found himself smiling as well. For a man who had spent most of his adult life avoiding emotional attachments, he'd discovered something valuable in the past few days: the satisfaction of helping others, of being part of something bigger than himself, was worth more than any legendary gold mine. As they rode into Tombstone just as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Ethan made a decision. He'd been a loner for too long, keeping people at arm's length to avoid the pain of loss. But Tommy and Jacob had shown him that some things were worth the risk. "Jacob," he said as they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, "I've been thinking. You and Tommy are going to need some help getting back on your feet after all this. And I've been looking for a reason to settle down, maybe try my hand at something besides law enforcement." Jacob's weathered face broke into a grin. "You thinking about becoming a trapper, Ethan?" "Maybe. Or maybe we could try our hand at legitimate mining. I hear there's still silver in these mountains, and with an honest operation." "Partners?" Jacob extended his hand. "Partners," Ethan agreed, shaking it firmly. Tommy whooped with joy, and even Sheriff Morrison smiled as he watched the three men, no longer strangers but family, plan their future together. The lost Dutchman's mine would remain lost forever, buried under tons of rock and the bones of those who had died seeking its imaginary treasure. But for Ethan Callahan, Jacob Blevins, and young Tommy, the real treasure had been found in the most unlikely of places, in the bonds of friendship forged in the crucible of danger and in the courage to trust again. As the stars began to appear in the vast Arizona sky, the three of them walked into the saloon to celebrate their survival and their new partnership. Behind them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping their secrets safe for future generations. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new, amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often."